Can I invite, as the last stage, the speakers to take a seat? And Pam, I don't know if you'd like to join as well. I think we're all there. And we have a few moments for discussion. We have moments for the audience to actually engage and ask their questions of the speakers.
Yes.
Doesn't have chairs. So let me, here we are facing each other. Questions from the audience about any of the themes that have covered in the first instance.
Andrew?
Oh, Mark. Oh, please, Peter.
So I had two questions. The first was, they were both really provoked by Andrew's concluding example, the case of the turning, and Prince learning Prudence from that. And it made me think, first of all, it struck me that there's such a huge difference between governing men and governing materials, that if there is a positive analogy from the material to the human, is this an insight into the fact that in the period that we're talking about, they didn't have a sharp, or at least these figures didn't have a sharp division between the animate and the inanimate? Is this insight actually into their possible thinking that material was animate in the same way that humans are animate? That was my first question. And then I got distracted, and I went back for the first time in a gazillion years and read Book 6 of the Nicomachean Ethics. Mark, thank you very much. And
or my apologies, whichever way that goes.
And well, it's not a fun read. It's true. But Aristotle there is very clear that phronesis does not apply either to science or to art. So my question is, where was the move made in this period to actually liberate phronesis from Aristotle's own interpretation so as to make it work this way?
Well, I think this is basically what I was trying to argue in my paper is, that first of all, Quiccheberg, and then I come across Simelea's text, that in subsuming Techne under Prudence in both cases, that there seems to be, and this is where I disagree with myself, and I'm saying initially this is not a theoretical text, as everybody wanted to argue it. My eventual conclusion was that it was indeed, and it had extremely high theoretical ambitions. In other words, he's attempting to figure out how to reconcile different forms of Aristotelian knowledge with each other. Since he's working for a prince, and he's basically trying to sell himself to princes as well, the highest good is that of governing the state and therefore the needs of the ruler. And the easiest argument to make is that Techne can be put at the service of the prince and therefore of the state. What I haven't really tackled yet, and I think he's doing the same thing, is actually to argue that theoretical knowledge, philosophical knowledge, also falls under the needs, the prudential needs of the prince to govern the state. Malleus, I think, is making a similar kind of argument, although in a different context. Already, he begins this in 1548, so that's almost 20 years before Quiccheberg. I don't know of any other text, as I mentioned, that attempts to reconcile Techne and Prudence that's any earlier than this. And so what I would ultimately argue is that this all emerges in the context of the formation of something that approximates what we think of as nation states. In other words, there's a centralized government, there's a centralized economy, there's centralized religion, and there's the need, in essence, to produce from scratch an apparatus for operating such a state. And what I've been very careful to do is to say that, for instance, Quiccheberg is proposing this. I would be much more hesitant to say that any Kunstkammer actually fulfilled those functions, but I think there's a claim being made for it.
Just on a methodological level, I was thinking about your question. Can we answer that question in a linear way? So would there be a moment where, for instance, phronesis and Techne, or the question that you asked? Because, for instance, Las Casas is contemporary of Quiccheberg, and he seems to, in fact, to tie two terms in a very different way, because Techne is, in fact, a springboard. It's not Techne is an evidence of prudence, it's not a springboard for prudence. So it's just, I think it methodological, I think it can be useful to perhaps to think that the answer to that, but there can be several moments where in fact that perspective has changed facing new situations, right? So yeah, simply that when we bring other situations, perhaps that there is no linearity, a moment when Aristotle, the Aristotelian way to think about phronesis changes and is tied with the question of Techne, but here we have two authors who write at the same time, so now end of the 50s, right? 1550s, really contemporary. And in fact, the relationship between Techne and Prudence is, they are related, but in a very different way. So just perhaps methodologically to think that there is no linear history of that change, but there have been changes in
That can I jump in on that? So I take that point, although I still would campaign for reason of state being significant here, because it was so self-consciously novel and so self-consciously anti-Aristotelian, and so self-consciously engaging with transforming the notion of prudence itself. So prudence is used as a synonym for reason of state, sometimes called extraordinary prudence, and they self-consciously distinguish it from any ancient political philosophy, that this is something that is new. So that would be, I think, one significant moment. And speaking of its relationship to ideas about progress, which is very prominent in writings on region of state, Trino Boccolini, for example, has this wonderful image that gets picked up endlessly by people, talking about the novelty of this. And he's in fact translated in the New World as the newfound politic. It's related both to Newfoundland, where it is translated, as well as the idea that it's a new discovery itself, the politics. He compares it to telescopes and microscopes, that prudence is this form of vision that is particularly technological, that is not what normal people can see. It is when your vision, your political vision, is trained in a certain way, that can see things that are far more subtle than otherwise would be possible. And so there's a theme of this political spectacles that takes off as a trope, as a way to symbolize this novel, new, much more technical way of observing the world.
I was just going to add that the example I started with this morning of Fox Maffeo, who was unfortunately drowned, makes exactly that point at exactly the same time. It's in the 1550s that he's publishing this, and he is also, interestingly, subsuming art, science, and so under prudence. And I think there's a lot of just general philosophic commentary at this time where humanists are trying to sort of grapple with Aristotelian ideas, and they're getting new vernacular translations and so forth. Gregor Reich, right in 1504 in the Margarita Philosophica, is trying to reconcile the Platonic and the Aristotelian notions of the virtues. He decides that they're the same thing, and they can be easily reconciled. But others, there is a history simply of philosophical thought of this tussling. And I think perhaps these practical applications emerge out of these texts and these teachings.
Can I speak to the animate question? That is one of the really interesting alchemical ideas that Prudence raises. He says, and this relates, I think, to Becker's later idea of Nahrung as the ultimate basis of all politics. He says that through alchemical processes, we materially become a polity. because it is through the circulation of money, the goods of the state, that actually the circulation of spirits in our blood happens. Because as we consume goods, our bodies themselves are transformed, and so those same spirits are circulating through all of our bodies and unifying us all into a polity. So as a social body, we are related to these material bodies, these inanimate bodies, in a very real way.
A little gold in my body.
So, thinking of the talks that we've had and the various perspectives that we've seen in context that Prudence has risen in, are we able to see a kind of trajectory, a kind of development that would lead to Peter's initial question of when does the collection give way to the book and why?
I think we need to have, which I think is totally possible. I think if we had another, few hours at this table, we could probably figure out like the different kind of registers of use of a collection, right? How do we think about the multi-use value of the collection, and then to figure out when do those use values, switch roles or switch places, right? We think about the Kunstkammer, right, as a form of representation in some instances, and then we think of the Kunstkammer as this place of gaining practical knowledge, right? And we can think of these two separate spectrums, and where do they meet, right? And where do they pull apart from one another? And it could be interesting to begin to think about what these two extremes how they might inform one another.
Yeah, I think that there are many different Kunstkammer and many different foci of, the compiler of that Kunstkammer, and then how those are used over the following centuries. And I think that, you have to, I don't know that there's a linear history, but there is certainly an increasing, compilation of practical techniques, through the encyclopedias up into the, 18th century encyclopedia, and then beyond into all kinds of, republications of recipe texts of, that then become in the 19th and early 20th century, recipes for boys, which are the same things that were, for kids basically, that were many of those recipes are the same as what produced Kunstkammer objects. And so, so I think that there's just there's a history that is not the kind of linear history of the Kunstkammer, but it kind of moves in many different directions. And so, yeah.
I was just very struck by Tina's riff in that comment that this is for experience, not for wonder, and that's such an interesting moment or expression in an urban context. And so one sees these ideas of the larger Kunstkammer perhaps percolating down. It's not top bottom. It's
and the interesting thing is spending money on wonder. He doesn't comment it. What does it mean? If you think it's a good investment or not, but then losing money, a lot of money in mining investment is then an act of charity, and that's what I think is very nice how he frames it.
Into a civic virtue.
Yes.
But some of that might be a kind of anti-court discourse about, collecting wonders and wasting money. I don't know, maybe that's particularly his Swiss outlook, but no, but in terms of the anti-court rhetoric.
I think in that term, desired who gets to have it is very important in terms of thinking about who desires to have objects in collections and in different social registers, how that's seen. much later, of course, Johann Daniel Meyer in the 1674 writes that he believes that there's a universal human impulse globally to study nature, and that we all have this desire, and he talks about how even very humble people will cobble together whatever kind of collection they have and keep it in whatever kind of little box or whatever they have. It's not just potentates as a sign of this kind of universal human desire, which he sees as a very positive thing. But there are all sorts of ways that could be criticized, and we've had this feast, this beautiful feast of wonderful papers intersected, but there are also lots of ways one could imagine fault lines and criticisms between different collections, as you say, against the courtly collection, or one could say against the merchant's collection. One can see these as competing and hostile towards each other as well. So I think that question of desire that keeps popping up at different places is crucial to think about. Its positive and negative valences.
Wenru, you had a
Yeah, I have a question. I'm just wondering if we can bring the gender perspective in it, because we talk a lot about prints, and Pamela was talking about boys' recipes in 20th century, and Tina mentioned earlier a little bit about noble women's healing activities in the court, and like certain pharmacy and apothecary activities may be the kind of role women do in the Kunstkammer. And I'm just wondering whether we can associate Prudence with noble women, kind of enlarge it. And I'm also struck by Jessica's talk about the idea of plentitude always associated with kind of feminized kind of imagery, and your image about Pan and Daphne is this kind of blurry of gender line is kind of a way of showing plenitude. So I'm just wondering whether we can talk more about women Prudence in a way.
I'll just say a couple of things that Duchess Anna in Munich also had, which Quiccheberg mentions, a collection of birds, which she allowed artists into. And I think that, I would say that women are more associated with ergonomia and the household, and therefore they need practical knowledge for that, whether it's really the prudence of governing. It is kind of governing the household, but I don't know whether it's articulated in those terms. And those books of, boys' books for recipes for fireworks and making coral and all those kinds of things that you see in Kunstkammer and, courtly collections in the 16th and 17th centuries were also for women. I should have mentioned that. They weren't for girls, but they were for women. So, it's both feminized and infantilized, all of those kinds of things in these 19th and early 20th century recipe books.
I remember hearing a talk several years ago about Isabella d'Este's studio, and her method of acquiring things, because she didn't have much of a budget. So partly she would coerce people through etiquette into giving her things. But one of the things that she did is she commissioned local artisans to make reproductions of objects or materials that she could not herself afford to buy. And I have to say, I have always wondered whether she was not doing, in essence, what I talked about in passing, say with Francesca, with the establishment of the Officio della Pietra Dure in Florence, of commissioning artisans to produce things, which then establishes a local industry and feeds a local economy and so forth. I don't have an answer to whether that's what she was doing, but I suspect it was. So I think women did play a role. Quiccheberg is somewhat nice in this way, because he mentions several areas, including some that are unexpected. So he mentions that women collect dolls. And they collect dolls of people from various places around the world. And the initial thought is, very cute and females with dolls. But what he goes on to say is that by studying the costumes of these dolls, you can learn about the customs of different people and about economic classes and social decorum and so forth. So he's really talking about them in sociological terms. So there is something of a discourse there.
Stephen Campbell's poem, Isabella d'Este, in particular her patronage of painters at her court, is based on this idea that she is assembling around herself images that attempt for her to contemplate on notions of eros, right, and ways to control her own appetite by the images that surround her. So that's one instance where we have. Again, it's not necessarily about prudence, but it's about ambition and appetites and desire that she's attempting to think about and perhaps control.
Prudence's example of the potentate that best exemplifies prudence is Queen Elizabeth. So women rulers can definitely be prudent, but he's and the subject matter that he's looking at, he cites women as authorities like Anna Becker that I mentioned, and the subject matter he's looking at is often women's practices. I mentioned the gloves, the fashion, and the cosmetics, and etc. But there's so much more. However, as always happens when you formalize anything in this period, the body of cameralist writings is extremely gendered. There aren't cameralists who are women. There aren't employees of the Kammer who are women. And so he is taking, as the same thing happens with experimental philosophers when they take experimental practices from the home, he's taking something that's very heterosocial, and by rendering it into this more quasi-disciplinary form, he is gendering it.
Thank you. I just wanted to add that some of these things might be applicable to the sorts of dollhouses that were being created. There are some really famous dollhouses where the women who own them commissioned everything inside, creating these economies of miniatures, but also showing this sort of prudence with the keeping of the household and budgeting, essentially, and all of these other things. And also Christina of Sweden, I think.
Yeah.
There's a lot of interesting stuff being done with her collection now.
Margaret of Austria. And she, I mean, and she was governing, so.
Oh no, please go ahead. I want to go in a different direction, so go ahead.
Oh, well, actually, I wanted to go in a different direction as well, but
Oh, please.
please, go first.
All right. Yeah, it strikes me, the life cycle of a collection is, I think, it gives interesting insight into the notion of prudence, Kunstkammer, and governance, because it's human intent, human desire, the person, the individual, the body, whatever, brings the collection into being. But unless there's a legacy or a syndicate or something put in place to keep the collection together, at the end of the person's life, the collection is going to go back out into the world to be recollected in other ways, in other places, across time. So the collection becomes like a strange kind of palimpsest that is constantly remaking itself in the hands and agency of each iteration. So what I think is super interesting is the extent to which these bodies are trying to keep the collection intact across time. It's for me a dynastic statement, really.
Although one could also mention, and this is something that Thomas Kunstkammer was mentioning over one of the coffee breaks, the diplomatic role of the collections, the constant gift-giving back and forth, which also, of course, is dynastic since they're also married back and forth. So rather than thinking about it as a kind of static dynasty,
and I was not thinking of it as static, though, but the intention to keep it from disintegrating, really, to keep some sort of core in place. And I'm thinking, jumping ahead a few centuries, to the case of the French crown jewels. The sale of the French crown jewels was a definitive move to disband a government and prevent it from ever reforming. So that's, I think, a really concrete example of how a collection holds together something in a really significant way.
I think coterminous with the foundation of Kunstkammer as court or state institutions is also the designation of objects within those collections as inalienable. Now, most often that is the regalia, but it can also include things like porphyry bowls or narwhal tusks and so forth. And for me, I've always found that an extremely important concept. Prior to the establishment of the kind of collecting that we've been talking about here today, court collections fundamentally took the form of Schatzkammern, of treasuries, which were compact forms of wealth that
like
could be
crown
and
jewels.
were sold off if you were conducting a war or whatever else it might be, with the declaration of inalienable objects that have to be retained within the family. That's suggesting a different system of value that enters into this.
True, but in the event that these things did have to get sold off, you would try and remake it and recreate it as soon as you could. Perhaps not with the same exact jewel or piece or crown or whatever that got sold to find whatever, but you would try and build the collection back up to refill the coffers, so to speak. So I guess in that sense, the inalienability becomes more sort of rooted in currency.
Yes, but if you expend the money in your savings account, you try to build that back up again.
Of course.
What happens when you start creating collections with objects that cannot and should not be sold off?
Exactly, yeah.
Is you're saying their symbolic value or their knowledge value is paramount rather than their market value. And that's now a different function of what a collection actually is.
And yet that's building on what Vera raised, there's that also flexibility, permeability of gift giving, and the idea that the collection has a certain facet of the collection is supposed to be mobile.
But not all of it.
Yeah.
I think
This sort of came up, I think, in relation to Dr. Asmussen's discussion of Rief's codex as sort of a surrogate for his collection. So I think this idea of the dissolution of collections and the extent to which these are time-bound phenomena kind of ties into the idea of the virtual collection. And I'd be interested to hear what you all sort of think about the relationship between these tangible collections and the sort of theoretical aspect of collecting that we've discussed, and then this idea of the sort of vestiges of collections, manuscripts, things like the Armamentarium Heroicum from Ambras. So I would be curious to hear about those intersections in your minds.
Yes, that's a huge topic to the end, because I think it's most interesting also with regard to my former research subject, Athanasius Kircher. His museum functioned most wonderfully in the printed book. There he could make all his connections visible, and the microcosmo to the macrocosmic dimension, everything worked, and it was enacted there. And that's the different that at the time where this, as this would be called catalogue, but it's not actually a catalogue, it's an own medium, was published. His museum was only in a very desperate state.
Yeah. It seems like the point that somebody made, I think it was Mark, about demonstrating to the eyes is really important, and I think that it's something new because, were there ever images of San Marco's, treasury, for example, in the 13th and 14th centuries? I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't know enough to know, but it does make one wonder. Whereas these, you think about those early collections of images of the Austrian treasuries. Yeah, and I mean, it's just like the picturing impulse of the 16th and 17th centuries, the representing impulse, in either illuminations or in, it just is a whole different, it seems like it's a whole different world.
I was going to say, one of the ways, a strategy which is used in order to kind of try to hold on to the objects in a way is by way of inventorying them, right? That's the kind of way to kind of keep the inventory static, right? And you get a sense of that desire to kind of say, even in the inventory, right? They'll say like, this person made this inventory on this date, and they'll say when they finished, and so you get really this kind of picture of the collection at this particular moment in time, that's very desired, because there's this implicit anxiety, right, that it's going to be dispersed and go away. And perhaps the inventory then provides that record of then, like you say, like reassembling this collection.
I would also say that the inventory is an own medium, because at the court of Julius at Wolfenbüttel, it is clearly seen that the inventory also includes promises, desires of things that that probably aren't even there. And
One of just about the picture impulse. So we just had a workshop for this Great Collective Wisdom last week in London about antiquarianism. A lot of it was about picturing and travel, and most of it focused on a later period when people were traveling and drawing lots of images. And it's really striking how with travel that's not the case in the period that we've been focusing on. So travel is so central to so many of our papers. The Ars Academica is essential, and yet the Ars Academica was such a textual genre. So Prudence gives lots of advice for the Ars Academica. He says you should look for paintings, note the paintings and the sculptures in every place that you go to that are significant, but he doesn't suggest you draw them. So it's really interesting how that isn't there, although that does develop later. But I do think that the cultural practice that we should reference at least once today, so that everything I love will be mentioned today, is the Alma Decorum, which is integral to the practice of travel and does transition this period to a highly visual, interactive genre. I was really reminded of it a lot with Reef and the Fortuna. You see a lot of those Fortuna figures drawn in, and there you do get depictions of curiosities every now and then in various towns that are visited. So I think that collecting practice is something that we shouldn't forget to mention as well. So tied to prudence, so tied to political practice. It's part of how you show your training. You mentioned Imhoff, the Imhoff family as well, and I've noticed that in a lot of the Imhoff Alba, there's a practice which I'm fascinated by. Please let me know if you see other examples, where they will have images, copies of paintings, and somewhere very miniature will be the arms of the inscriber, super, super small. I need a little bit to see it, which to me indicates that political prudence, that vision I was talking about that allows you to see subtlety that we're talking about, that instead of just splashing your arms across the pages would be typical of your regular nobleman, this person is so trained in these arts of perception that they'd rather be miniaturized within a depiction of a painting, which I think really speaks to the moment.
In the interest of time, and I'm aware that we're running over and there is wine outside, I'm going to leave the last comment to Alessandra.
No, I think your question is great, and I think perhaps we should have thought a little bit more about illustrated inventories. I mean, many of the objects, for instance, that I presented were also illustrated in later inventories. The Museum Metallico represents one of the mystic masks in a very, very subtle and faithful way. So then or the Setala, when they represent the objects coming from Africa or the objects coming from the Americas. So I think this is a great question. And going back to Las Casas, I think that we can, I mean, it's not illustrated, but we can think about this source as a kind of textual Wunderkammer, especially because he describes these objects in connections with Old World antiquities and Old World artifacts. So it's not an illustrated, he does not illustrate these objects, but there is also this impulse of representation through the text and to connect and to understand the objects from the Indies, from his Indies in connection to the Old World. So in a kind of dynamic, very, very similar to the Wunderkammer. So it's textual Wunderkammer.
Well, we're going to leave this here, we're going to pause, and I hope very much that the project will continue. This has been a wonderful start. I'd like to thank all our speakers today, and indeed our audience for staying the course. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you.